How did you feel this weekend when you heard some of the conversations in broadcast media, in print, which seemed to avoid tackling the elephant in the room?
I thought it was almost surreal, to be completely honest with you, because, a man had been arrested. The police had declared this a suspected terrorist attack with potential Islamist motivation. And yet we were talking about Twitter storms. We were talking about the cancer of anonymous accounts on the internet. We were talking about how public life had become a bit nasty and not particularly civil. And it just seemed completely detached from the reality of what we were talking about. And as you said in your introduction there, and as I wrote in a piece on Spike this week, you felt the need to point out that David Amess was not killed by nasty tweets. He wasn't the victim of a horrendous Twitter storm or pylon. He was the victim of a suspected terrorist attack. And the reason why our conversation became dominated by all these other concerns, I think there's various different reasons for it. I can understand that MPs just in general would think about their own concerns about their safety and the kind of flack that they would get. But I think there was also a pretty clear component of this, which was to try to deflect attention away from what is the suspected motivation here, which is Islamism. And we see that in the wake of every terrorist atrocity effectively these days in Britain. So it just felt unserious and quite surreal, to be brutally honest with you. And I think if we're going to get to grips with what not just happened here, but what seems to be happening in society full stop, we can't just dodge those difficult conversations for ones that the commentariat and the political class find a little bit easier, to be frank.
Tom, I've been doing this job for a while, and I was in one of my monologues earlier this week listing I was depressed at how long that list of terror atrocities I've stood at and reported from, and I've definitely seen an evolution. In the first 10 years after 9/11, there was a candour, there was a willingness to grapple with some really quite difficult themes, and I would say over the subsequent 10 years, it's gone away, and now there's a kind of grammar to terror attacks, and there's lots of talk of coming to terms with and long focus pulls of teddy bears and helium balloons and books of condolence and candlelit vigils, and it feels like a colossal exercise in displacement.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, we're invited to respond to terrorist atrocities as if they were basically a natural disaster at this point, as if it's something horrible that happened. We wish it really hadn't. We mourn the victims, but then we move on. And I think all you've got to do is contrast what happens when a far-right attack happens. I mean, one case I thought was really striking was when the Charlottesville protests in America. So you had all these neo-Nazi far-right marches. One counter-protester was mowed over by an alt-right extremist. That happened the same week as the Barcelona attacks, in which scores of people were mowed down in an Islamist terrorist attack. And yet we've forgotten about the latter completely. And also, if you just compare the response to David Amess's killing to the response to Joe Cox's, I mean, in recent days, it's almost become verboten to talk about the fact that this is being investigated as a terrorist incident. There was an editorial in The Observer which referred to these facts as kind of just scraps of information that only a wrong would latch onto. If you'd have said in the wake of Joe Cox's killing by a far-right extremist that the fact he seemed to have links to far-right organisations, the fact that seemed to be his motivation, wasn't really relevant, we shouldn't really talk about it, you would rightly have been condemned. Yet for whatever reason, and we kind of know what the reasons are, in terms of this hatred, this Islamist hatred of Western society, of pluralism, of all kinds of things that we should celebrate, we don't have the vocabulary to even name it, let alone try and challenge it. And that's really...
Just as a footnote on the comparison between what happened in Barcelona and the States, sometimes that's, I think, because we're obsessed with what's happening in the States, and there's just the wherewithal, there's just the endless live interviews and picture coming from a country where they all speak English. It could be partly the reasons that. Can we just, speaking of America and big American corporations, and one's the biggest streaming corporation of all, Netflix, they've downed tools because they don't like what a comedian was saying about trans people. Tell us more.
So this is the Netflix walkout. So in response to Dave Chappelle's latest comedy special, it's called The Closer, in which he makes jokes about LGBT issues, about trans people in particular. People who work at Netflix have basically organised this protest. They've downed tools, as you've said. Their list of demands basically boil down to, we don't want the special removed, we just want to make sure it never happens again, effectively to kind of hire people to review content who are from the particular communities addressed and all the rest of it. And I just think it's really quite striking. I mean, one of the CEOs of Netflix actually made quite a strong statement in the past week saying that in response to all of this backlash, that we believe in freedom of expression, that also we don't buy this idea that content, particularly comedic content, which we all accept pushes boundaries, tries to be outrageous, all the rest of it, contributes to real world harm. We don't believe that. He's since had to say he's since been forced to say that his words were hasty and he apologises for any hurt. So it's just so striking that even at these institutions in which you would think the bottom line ruled, again, to deal with these concerns.
Tom, thanks very much.